Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. Martin Davis had always believed that life was a series of carefully drawn lines, plans, blueprints, calculations. You measured twice, cut once, and everything stayed upright. That was the theory, anyway. Reality, as he was learning, had a nasty habit of ignoring theory. The accident changed everything. It wasn't the kind of disaster that made headlines for weeks. No deaths, thank God. But injuries, serious ones, were enough to send shockwaves through the company. And when the review board combed through the blueprints, the verdict was swift: cost-cutting measures had compromised safety. The kind of shortcuts Martin had flagged 14 months ago in a detailed report, complete with risk assessments and cost analyses. He'd handed it to his supervisor like a lifeline. His supervisor had smiled, thanked him, and tossed it into the corporate abyss. Now, Martin was the scapegoat. The official language was polite: oversight, failure to escalate. But the implication was clear: Martin Davis had ruined lives. His reputation was shredded. His inbox filled with rejection notices before he even had the chance to send out resumes. Structural engineering wasn't just his career, it was his identity. And now it was gone. The only silver lining? Jessica. Not because she stayed. Quite the opposite. The moment she heard he'd lost his job, she packed up her designer handbag and left like the house was on fire. No tears, no hesitation, just a cold, "I can't do this," and the click of her heels on the hardwood floor. Martin smiled as he opened the door for her. A calm, almost serene smile that confused her enough to stop mid-step. "Don't go away angry, Jessica," he said softly. "Just go away." Her brows knitted in disbelief. "You think this is funny?" "No," Martin replied, holding the door wider. "I think it's a relief." She left in a storm of indignation, muttering something about him being heartless. Martin closed the door behind her and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. He wasn't heartbroken. He wasn't even surprised. He'd seen the signs, the way her eyes lit up more for shopping bags than for him, the subtle shift from affection to expectation. He'd been planning to end it anyway. She just saved him the trouble. For a few weeks, Martin drifted. Depression wasn't his style, but it crept in like fog, soft, suffocating, and hard to shake. Every rejection email was another weight on his chest. The future he'd spent his entire adult life chasing had evaporated. Maybe forever. One night, sitting in his apartment surrounded by boxes he hadn't unpacked since Jessica left, Martin stared at the ceiling and thought about his father's words. The greatest adventures begin with a single decision. So he made one. He packed up his life, sold what he didn't need, and left the West Coast behind. No fanfare, no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet drive east toward a small Midwestern town he'd found on a real estate site. Population, 1,200. Maybe 1,202 if you counted the cats that strutted down Main Street like they owned the place. Martin wasn't running away. He was starting over. And for the first time in months, he felt something that surprised him. Excitement. Chapter 2. Goodbye West Coast. Martin Davis had never been sentimental about places. He believed memories belonged to people, not walls or streets. Still, as he stood in the doorway of his apartment for the last time, he felt something tighten in his chest. The space was stripped bare, just echoes of laughter, arguments, and quiet nights staring at blueprints spread across the kitchen table. It smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust, like the ghost of his old life refusing to leave. He locked the door and slid the key under the mat. Someone else would live here soon. Someone with plans and dreams that hadn't yet been shattered. Martin walked down the hall without looking back. He didn't need to. The past wasn't behind him. It was packed neatly in the trunk of his car, along with everything he hadn't sold or donated. A few boxes of clothes, his tools, and a laptop. That was all he needed. The drive east was long and quiet. Martin didn't rush. He wasn't running from anything. He was moving toward something he couldn't quite name yet. The highway stretched like an endless ribbon, flanked by mountains that gave way to plains, then to rolling fields that looked like they'd been painted in shades of gold and green. He stopped at diners with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt hope. He slept in motels where the neon signs flickered like tired eyes. And somewhere between mile marker 1,200 and 1,300, he realized he was smiling. Not because he had a plan, he didn't. But because for the first time in years, he felt free. No deadlines. No meetings. No supervisor breathing down his neck with a fake smile and a hidden knife. Just open road and possibility. By the time he crossed into the Midwest, autumn had begun to whisper across the landscape. Leaves blushed crimson and gold, and the air carried that crisp edge that hinted at winter's approach. Martin rolled down the window and let the wind slap his face awake. He thought about his father again, about that old saying, "The greatest adventures begin with a single decision." Martin had made his. Now he just had to live with it. The town, the GPS announced his arrival with a cheerful tone that felt almost sarcastic. "You have reached your destination." Martin slowed as the highway melted into a two-lane road lined with tired houses and sagging fences. A faded sign welcomed him. Maplewood, population 1,204. Someone had scrawled, "and 3 cats," in permanent marker beneath it. Martin chuckled. At least the town had a sense of humor. Maplewood looked like a postcard someone had left in the sun too long. The paint on the storefronts had peeled, and the sidewalks were cracked like old porcelain. But there was life here. Kids on bikes racing down the street, A woman sweeping her porch, an old man in a lawn chair waving at every car that passed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Martin drove slowly, taking it all in. He passed a diner with a sign that read "Best Pie in the County," the exclamation point hanging by a thread. A hardware store with a window display that looked like it hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. And a park that had seen better days, its swings rusted and its grass overgrown. Martin felt something stir in his chest, not pity, but possibility. The house, the realtor had called it, a charming ranch-style home with character. Martin suspected character was code for needs work. She wasn't wrong. The house sat on a quiet street where every home looked like it had fought a long battle with time and lost. The roof sagged slightly, the paint was peeling, and the front steps were warped like old bones. But Martin didn't see decay. He saw resilience. He parked in the cracked driveway and stepped out, breathing in the scent of dry leaves and distant with smoke. The house wasn't pretty, but it spoke to him. It reminded him of himself, battered, worn, but still standing, still capable of becoming something better. Inside, the air was stale, and the floors creaked under his boots. The walls were scuffed, the kitchen outdated, and the bathroom looked like a museum exhibit from 1978. Martin grinned. Perfect. He didn't want turnkey. He wanted a project, a chance to build something with his own hands, to leave a mark that mattered. He walked through each room slowly, imagining what it could be. Fresh paint, new floors, a garden in the backyard, maybe a workshop in the garage where he could tinker and plan. The possibilities stretched out like blueprints in his mind, and for the first time since the accident, he felt that old spark, the one that came when he looked at something broken and saw how to make it whole. The first night, Martin carried in his boxes as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. He didn't bother unpacking much, just a mattress on the floor, a blanket, and his laptop. The rest could wait. He ordered a pizza from the only place in town that delivered and ate it sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, staring at the empty walls. It was quiet here. Not the sterile silence of his old apartment, but a living quiet, the kind that hummed with distant laughter and the rustle of leaves outside. Martin liked it. He liked the way the house seemed to breathe, like it was waiting for him to bring it back to life. After dinner, he stepped onto the porch and looked up at the sky. Out here, the stars weren't shy. They spilled across the darkness like diamonds scattered on velvet. Martin leaned against the railing, careful not to put too much weight on it, because it looked like it might collapse, and let the cool night air wash over him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel like a man whose life had fallen apart. He felt like a man standing at the edge of something new, something good. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, that didn't matter. Chapter 3. A House That Speaks. Morning sunlight spilled through the dusty blinds like a polite intruder, nudging Martin awake. He lay on the mattress for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house settling around him. It sounded tired, but not defeated, like an old soldier still standing after too many battles. Martin could relate. He brewed coffee in a dented percolator he bought at a thrift store on the way into town. The aroma filled the kitchen, masking the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. He sipped slowly, leaning against the counter, and surveyed the room. The cabinets were a shade of yellow that had probably been fashionable when disco was king. The linoleum floor was cracked like a dry riverbed. Martin smiled. He didn't see flaws. He saw a challenge. After breakfast, he stepped outside to inspect the porch. The wooden steps sagged like they were carrying the weight of the world. The railing leaned at an angle that suggested it had given up on its job years ago. Martin crouched, running his fingers over the splintered boards. They were warped, rotten in places, but still clinging stubbornly to their nails. He admired that kind of persistence. "This is where we start," he murmured. The neighborhood, as Martin worked, he noticed the rhythm of the street. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't silent either. A dog barked in the distance. A lawnmower droned 2 houses down. Kids' laughter floated on the breeze like music from another time. Every so often, a car rolled by slowly, the driver sneaking curious glances at the newcomer dismantling his porch. By midday, Martin had stripped most of the old boards. Sweat streaked his forehead, and sawdust clung to his shirt like confetti. He paused to drink water and caught sight of movement across the street. An old man sat in a lawn chair, legs crossed, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. He wore a faded army cap and an expression that hovered between amusement and suspicion. Martin raised a hand in greeting. The old man nodded once, then called out in a voice that carried like a drill sergeant's. "You planning to tear down the whole house, or just the parts that keep it standing?" Martin laughed. "Just the porch, for now." The man grunted, as if filing that answer away for later judgment. "Name's Walter," he said. "Been living here since Nixon was president." "You?" "Martin," he replied. "Just moved in yesterday." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened. "Well, Martin, welcome to Maplewood. Don't let the peeling paint fool you. This town's got heart." Martin believed him. He could feel it already, humming beneath the surface like a buried current. Curiosity on 2 wheels. By late afternoon, Martin noticed he wasn't alone. A pair of kids on bikes coasted to a stop at the edge of his yard, watching him with wide eyes. One was maybe 10, the other a lanky teenager with a baseball cap, turned backward. They didn't speak at first, just stared like Martin was performing some kind of magic trick. "What's up?" Martin asked, wiping his hands on a rag. The younger one pointed at the pile of splintered boards. You building something? Fixing something, Martin corrected. This porch has seen better days. The older kid tilted his head. Looks like work. Martin smiled. It is, but it's the good kind. They lingered a moment longer, then pedaled off, whispering to each other like conspirators. Martin chuckled. He remembered being that age, curious about everything, convinced adults held secrets worth uncovering. The first spark of an idea. As the sun dipped lower, Martin sat on the porch steps. Well, what was left of them, and looked at the street. The houses wore their age openly. Peeling paint, sagging gutters, yards that had surrendered to weeds. But beneath the wear, Martin saw potential. He imagined fresh porches, trimmed lawns, flowers blooming along sidewalks. He pictured kids playing in a park that wasn't rusted and forgotten. The thought came quietly, like a seed dropping into soil. What if this wasn't just about my house? What if it was about all of us? Martin didn't chase the idea yet. He let it sit, warm and promising, while the sky blushed pink and gold. Nightfall and resolve. Inside, Martin showered off the day's grit and collapsed onto his mattress. His muscles ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that said you'd done something real. He opened his laptop and started sketching plans for the porch. Nothing fancy, just solid and clean. But as he worked, his mind wandered to the kids on bikes, to Walter's wry smile, to the quiet resilience of this street. Maybe his father was right. Maybe the greatest adventures didn't start with grand gestures. Maybe they started with something as simple as rebuilding a porch. Martin closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Tomorrow, he'd start cutting new boards. Tomorrow, he'd make this house speak again. Chapter 4. The Kids in the Porch. The next morning, Martin woke to the sound of laughter outside his window. He rolled out of bed, stretched, and peeked through the blinds. Two kids on bikes were circling his driveway, like vultures waiting for something to die. When they saw him, they waved, big, exaggerated waves that made Martin chuckle. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, and found the same pair from yesterday, plus 3 more. They were perched on their bikes like sentinels, eyes wide with curiosity. You starting again? The youngest asked, his voice cracking with excitement. Martin nodded. That's the plan. What are you going to do today? Another chimed in. Cut new boards, Martin said. Replace the steps. The kids exchanged looks like he'd just announced a magic show. Martin sipped his coffee, amused. He remembered being that age, hungry for something interesting, something that felt bigger than the small orbit of school and chores. By noon, the audience had grown. 8 kids now, ranging from 9 to 16, sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk like they were waiting for a movie to start. Martin tried to ignore them at first, focusing on measuring and cutting, but their chatter was impossible to tune out. Think he's building a castle? Nah, it's a porch. Porches can be castles if you believe hard enough. Martin laughed under his breath. Finally, he set down his hammer and walked over to the group. They froze, like deer caught in headlights. All right, Martin said, scanning their faces. Who knows how to swing a hammer? Every hand shot up. Some kids jumped to their feet, practically vibrating with eagerness. Martin raised an eyebrow. Really? All of you? Yep, the oldest declared. I helped my uncle with his shed. I built a birdhouse once, another bragged. Martin grinned. Okay, here's the deal. If you want to help, you need permission from your parents. No exceptions. Groans erupted like he'd just canceled Christmas. Martin held up a hand. Safety first. I'll write up permission slips. Bring them back signed, and you're in. The kids stared at him like he'd invented a new holiday. Then they scattered, pedaling furiously toward home, shouting about permission slips like town criers. The parents arrive. Martin went inside, typed up a simple form, name, parent signature, emergency contact, and printed a stack. When the kids returned, they snatched the papers like golden tickets and vanished again. By late afternoon, parents began trickling in. Some came curious, others cautious. Martin greeted each one with calm professionalism, explaining the project and his plan to teach the kids basic skills, how to measure, cut, hammer without smashing fingers. He promised supervision, safety goggles, and patience. To his surprise, every parent agreed. Some lingered to watch, folding chairs in tow. Others brought snacks, bags of chips, pitchers of lemonade. The sidewalk turned into a makeshift community lounge, laughter bubbling like a language everyone understood. Walter showed up too, leaning on his cane, grinning like a man who'd seen this movie before. You're stirring up trouble, son, he said, eyes twinkling. The good kind. Martin smiled. About time this street woke up. The work begins. With permission slips signed and goggles distributed, Martin handed out hammers. The kids attacked the project with the enthusiasm of a demolition crew on a sugar high. Nails bent, boards splintered, and Martin's porch began to resemble modern art. But he didn't care. Every dent, every crooked nail was a badge of effort. Slow down, Martin coached gently. Measure twice, cut once. Why? A boy asked, hammer poised midair. Because wood doesn't grow back, Martin said, deadpan. The parents laughed. The kids groaned but obeyed. Slowly, the chaos settled into rhythm. Measure, cut, hammer, shear. Martin moved among them like a conductor, correcting grips, praising effort, teaching patience. By sunset, the porch was taking shape. It wasn't perfect, far from it. A few boards sat slightly uneven, and the railing leaned like it had opinions. But Martin loved it. It wasn't just a porch anymore. It was a story written in wood and sweat and laughter. The neighborhood changes. As Martin packed up tools, he noticed something remarkable. The street felt different, lighter, warmer. Parents chatted like old friends. Kids bragged about their handiwork. Walter told war stories to anyone who'd listen, his voice booming like a brass band. Martin stood on the new steps, looking out at the scene, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about fixing a porch. It was about fixing something bigger, something that had been broken long before he arrived. He didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But the idea was there, glowing like an ember. What if we did more? What if we fixed the whole neighborhood? Martin smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you know you're standing at the edge of something extraordinary. Tomorrow, he'd finish the porch. But tonight, he let himself enjoy the sound of laughter drifting through the autumn air. Chapter 5. Enter Susan Evans. The porch was almost finished. Martin stood back, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and studied the work. It wasn't perfect. He could see every uneven cut, every nail that didn't quite sit flush, but it was solid, strong, honest. And in a strange way, the imperfections made him like it more. They told a story of effort, of learning, of kids who had never held a hammer before but swung like their lives depended on it. Speaking of kids, half the neighborhood seemed to be sprawled across his front yard. Some sat cross-legged on the grass, others perched on their bikes, all of them watching Martin like he was the star of a reality show called Extreme Porch Makeover. He tried ignoring them at first, but that lasted about a day. Then he'd had an idea, a dangerous thing for a man with tools and too much free time. Anyone know how to swing a hammer? He'd asked. Hands shot up like fireworks. The kids practically vibrated with excitement. Martin had smiled, gone inside, and printed out permission slips. If their parents were okay with it, they could help. He wasn't about to risk a lawsuit because little Timmy decided to test gravity with a nail gun. To his surprise, the parents said yes. More than that, they showed up. Some brought folding chairs and sat on the sidewalk, chatting and laughing like they hadn't in years. Others brought snacks, lemonade, even a toolbox or two. It was nice. Strange, but nice. Martin had moved here to disappear, to lick his wounds in peace. Instead, he'd somehow become the neighborhood's unofficial project manager. And he didn't hate it. The woman with the coffee. It was late afternoon when Martin heard a voice behind him. You know, turquoise isn't really a neutral color. He turned, hammer still in hand, and saw her. She stood at the edge of his yard, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee in a cardboard tray. Sunlight caught in her hair, turning the chestnut strands into threads of gold. She wore jeans and a faded t-shirt that read Maplewood Autumn Festival, 2018, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek, like she'd been baking before deciding to wander over. Her eyes, hazel, sharp, and curious, met his, and for a second, Martin forgot how to speak. Then he remembered the turquoise trim on his porch railing and laughed. Yeah, well, I was going for subtle, but the design committee overruled me. She glanced at the cluster of girls sitting on the steps, giggling behind their hands. The committee. Fierce negotiators, I bet. Brutal, Martin said. I barely survived the color debate. That earned him a smile. Not a polite, neighborly smile, but the kind that reached her eyes and lingered. She stepped closer, holding out one of the cups. Peace offering. Black, no sugar. You look like a black coffee kind of guy. Martin accepted the cup, surprised. Thanks. And you are? Susan, she said. Susan Evans. My son's one of your apprentices. She nodded toward the yard, where a lanky 12-year-old was trying to balance a hammer on his nose. Eric. Martin grinned. He's got potential. Not sure about the hammer trick, though. Susan rolled her eyes. He's 12. Everything's a trick. They stood there for a moment, sipping coffee while the kids argued about who got to paint the mailbox next. Martin stole a glance at her, curious. There was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, chin lifted, that spoke of quiet strength. But there was tiredness, too, in the faint shadows under her eyes, in the way her fingers curled around the coffee cup like it was the only warm thing in her life. You live around here? Martin asked. 2 streets over, she said. Been here my whole life. Nice town, Martin said. Susan snorted softly. That's one word for it. Martin chuckled. Not a fan. I love it, she said quickly, then shrugged. I just wish it loved itself a little more. You know, it used to be beautiful. Now, she gestured toward the cracked sidewalks, the peeling paint, the park down the street that looked like a set from a post-apocalyptic movie. People stopped caring, stopped trying. Martin followed her gaze, then looked back at his porch. Maybe they just needed a reason. Susan tilted her head, studying him. And you think you're that reason? Martin smiled faintly. No, but maybe this porch is. Susan's story. They talked while the kids worked, or pretended to. Martin learned that Susan was 29, a single mom, and had been since she was 17. Eric's father had vanished the moment he heard the word pregnant, and Susan hadn't seen him since. She didn't complain, didn't even sound bitter. Just matter of fact, like life had handed her a raw deal, and she decided to make something edible out of it anyway. I work 2 jobs, she said, not bragging, just stating a fact. Diner in the mornings, grocery store at night. It's not glamorous, but it keeps the lights on. Martin nodded, impressed. That's a lot. She shrugged. You do what you have to. Eric's worth it. Martin believed her. He could see it in the way her eyes softened when she looked at her son, in the way her voice warmed when she talked about him. Everything she did, every sacrifice, was for that kid. And Martin respected the hell out of that. The spark, as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the kids packed up their tools and headed home, chattering about the next workday. Susan lingered, helping Martin gather stray nails and paintbrushes. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the kind that feels easy, not awkward. When the last brush was rinsed and the last hammer hung, Martin leaned against the porch railing, carefully, because turquoise or not, it was still drying, and looked at her. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. "Thanks for keeping Eric busy," she replied. "He hasn't stopped talking about this porch since yesterday. I think you might be his new hero." Martin smiled. "High praise. I'll try not to let it go to my head." Susan laughed, and the sound did something to him. Something warm and unexpected. He hadn't felt this in a long time. Not with Jessica, not with anyone. It wasn't fireworks or lightning bolts. It was quieter than that. A spark, small but steady, like the first flicker of a flame. He didn't act on it. Not yet. He wasn't ready, and maybe she wasn't either. But as Susan walked away, her hair catching the last light of day, Martin knew one thing for sure. For the first time since his life fell apart, he wasn't just rebuilding a porch. He was rebuilding himself. Bonus scene, Susan at home. The Evans house was small, but it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent, and the mismatched furniture carried the kind of wear that spoke of years of use, not neglect. Susan dropped her keys in the chipped ceramic bowl by the door and kicked off her sneakers, sighing as the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. Eric was sprawled on the couch, legs dangling over the armrest, a comic book balanced on his chest. He looked up when she walked in, his face lighting up like sunrise. "Mom, you should have seen it today." "Martin let me use the power drill. The real one, not the baby one." Susan raised an eyebrow, amused. "Did you drill anything you weren't supposed to?" Eric grinned sheepishly. "Only once." She laughed, ruffling his hair as she passed. "Sounds like you had fun." "Martin's cool," Eric said, sitting up now, his voice bubbling with excitement. "He doesn't treat us like kids. He explains stuff, like why we're doing it, not just how. And he listens. Like, really listens." Susan paused in the kitchen doorway, her hand resting on the frame. "He listens." Funny how that word hit her harder than she expected. She couldn't remember the last time someone really listened to her. Not just nodded while waiting for their turn to talk, but listened like what she said mattered. She shook the thought away and headed into the kitchen. The counters were cluttered with the remnants of a rushed morning, cereal boxes, a half-empty coffee mug, a note reminding her to pay the electric bill. Susan moved through the space on autopilot, tidying as she went, her mind elsewhere. Martin Davis. She hadn't expected him. When the neighborhood gossip mill started buzzing about the new guy moving into the old ranch house, Susan pictured someone older, maybe retired, looking for peace and quiet. Not a man in his 20s with shoulders like a linebacker and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of something heavy, and the resilience to bear it. He was different. Not just because he was easy on the eyes, though, God help her, he was, but because he didn't seem like a man running from failure. He seemed like a man building something new, piece by piece, with his own hands. That kind of determination was rare. Attractive, even. Not that Susan had time for attractive. She had Eric, 2 jobs, and a life held together with duct tape and sheer willpower. Still, when Martin smiled at her today, really smiled, like he saw her, not just the single mom with flour on her cheek, something inside her shifted. A spark, small but undeniable. And that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Susan opened the fridge, staring at the contents without seeing them. She couldn't afford to get her hopes up. Men like Martin didn't stick around. They didn't choose women like her, women with baggage, with responsibilities, with lives too messy to fit into neat little boxes. And even if he did, what if it hurt Eric? What if she let someone in and he left, like all the others? No, better to keep her guard up. Better to smile, make small talk, and keep her heart locked tight where no one could break it. But as she pulled out the milk and closed the fridge, Susan caught herself smiling. Just a little. Just enough to admit what she wouldn't say out loud. Martin Davis was trouble. The good kind. Chapter 6. A Neighborhood Awakens. The porch was finished. Not perfect. Martin could see every dent, every uneven brushstroke of turquoise trim, but it was beautiful in its own way. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was laughter, effort, and a dozen small victories hammered into place by kids who had never built anything before. Martin stood on the steps, hands on his hips, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Pride. The neighborhood noticed too. People slowed as they walked by, craning their necks to admire the transformation. The porch had become a conversation starter, a spark in a place that had been asleep for too long. And Martin, who had come here to disappear, found himself at the center of something he didn't quite understand. The barbecue idea, it started with Walter. The old man shuffled across the street one evening, his cane tapping the pavement like a metronome. He stopped at the edge of Martin's yard, squinting at the porch with a look that was equal parts approval and suspicion. "Not bad," Walter said, voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and opinions. "Could use more turquoise." Martin laughed. "Don't encourage them." Walter grinned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You know what this calls for?" Martin raised an eyebrow. "A structural integrity test?" "A party," Walter said. "Big one. Food, music, the works. This neighborhood's been dead for years. You woke it up. Time to celebrate. Martin opened his mouth to protest. He wasn't exactly Mr. Social, but Walter steamrolled right over him. I'll bring the grill, Walter said. You bring the meat. And beer. Lots of beer. By the time Walter hobbled back across the street, Martin realized he'd been drafted into hosting a neighborhood barbecue. And strangely, he didn't mind. The day of the party, Saturday, dawned bright and warm, the kind of autumn day that feels like a gift. Martin spent the morning setting up tables in his yard, stringing lights across the porch, and hauling coolers filled with ice and soda. Walter arrived at noon with a grill that looked like it had survived 3 wars and a box of bratwursts big enough to feed an army. By 2 o'clock, the street was alive. Neighbors streamed in carrying dishes, potato salad, baked beans, pies that looked like they belonged in magazines. Kids darted between tables, laughing and shrieking, while adults settled into folding chairs with plates piled high. Music drifted from a speaker someone had brought, a mix of country and classic rock that made Martin smile. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't polished, but it was perfect. Martin manned the dunk tank. Yes, the dunk tank. Walter had insisted on renting one, claiming it was tradition, though Martin suspected he just wanted to see him soaked. Martin sat on the narrow plank, taunting the kids with mock insults while they lined up to throw baseballs at the target. You throw like my grandma, Martin called as a ball sailed wide. The next kid hit dead center. Martin plunged into the water with a splash that sent cheers erupting from the crowd. He surfaced, sputtering, and saw Walter doubled over with laughter, tears streaming down his weathered face. Creative insults, Davis. Walter hollered. Try harder. Martin grinned and climbed back onto the plank, dripping and grinning like an idiot. For the first time in a long time, he felt light, free, happy. Susan arrives. He saw her through the crowd. Susan, carrying a tray of something that smelled like heaven. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she wore a simple sundress that made Martin forget how to breathe for a second. Eric trailed behind her, already scanning the dunk tank with predatory intent. Martin waved, and Susan smiled. A real smile, warm and unguarded. She set the tray on a table and walked over, dodging a rogue football. Looks like you're popular, she said, eyeing the line of kids waiting to dunk him. Turns out humiliation is a crowd pleaser, Martin replied, grinning. Susan laughed, and the sound curled around him like sunlight. You need a break? From this? Never, Martin said. I live for the thrill. She shook her head, amused. You're something else, Martin Davis. He wanted to ask what that meant, but Eric chose that moment to hit the target dead on. Martin plunged into the water again, and Susan's laughter followed him down. The announcement, as dusk settled and the lights twinkled across the porch, Martin stood on the steps and looked out at the crowd. The neighborhood was alive, really alive. People were talking, laughing, sharing stories. Kids chased each other across the grass, their faces sticky with barbecue sauce and joy. It was everything Martin hadn't known he needed. He cleared his throat, and the chatter quieted. I just wanted to say thank you, Martin began, voice steady but warm. When I moved here, I didn't know what to expect. Honestly, I thought I'd be fixing up a porch and minding my own business. But you showed up. You helped. You made this more than a project. You made it a community. Heads nodded. Smiles spread. Martin felt something swell in his chest. So, he continued, I've been thinking. This neighborhood has a lot of potential, and I'd like to keep going. Not just my house, everyone's. Repairs, landscaping, whatever needs doing. We can make this place beautiful again. Together. For a moment, silence. Then the kids started cheering, and the adults followed. Walter pumped his fist like a man half his age. Martin grinned. Guess that's a yes. Susan's reaction. Later, as the party wound down and the stars blinked awake, Martin found himself standing beside Susan near the porch. Eric was off with a pack of kids, chasing fireflies like they were treasure. Big plans, Susan said, her voice soft but teasing. You sure you're ready for that? Martin looked at her, really looked at her, the strength in her eyes, the curve of her smile, and felt that spark again, brighter this time. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I am. Susan held his gaze for a moment, then smiled. Good. This town could use someone like you. Martin wanted to tell her he wasn't doing it for the town, not entirely. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he smiled back, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a wait. It felt like a promise. Chapter 7. The Park Project. The porch was just the beginning. By mid-October, Maplewood looked different. Cleaner. Brighter. Lawns trimmed. Fences repaired. Flower beds blooming like little bursts of hope. The turquoise trim on Martin's porch had become a neighborhood joke. Half the kids wanted to paint everything turquoise now, but Martin didn't mind. If color was what it took to wake this place up, then let the rainbow loose. But the biggest challenge still loomed, the park. Once upon a time, Maplewood Park had been the heart of the town, a place for picnics, birthday parties, summer baseball games. Now it was a graveyard of good intentions. Rusted swings creaked in the wind, weeds strangled the grass, and the picnic awnings sagged like tired shoulders. Martin had walked past it a dozen times, each time feeling the same tug in his chest. This wasn't just neglect. It was surrender. Not anymore. The meeting, Martin called a neighborhood meeting on his porch one crisp Saturday morning. Parents gathered with steaming mugs of coffee, kids clustered on the steps like they were waiting for a pep talk before a championship game. Walter sat in his usual spot, a folding chair that looked like it had been stolen from a church basement. cane resting across his knees. Martin cleared his throat. All right, team. We've done great so far. Houses look better, streets look cleaner. But there's one thing left that's been bugging me. The park, Susan said softly, almost to herself. Martin nodded. The park. It's a mess. And I think we can fix it. Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. The kids perked up like someone had just announced free pizza. But here's the twist, Martin continued, smiling. I'm not running this one. Heads turned. Susan raised an eyebrow. You're not. Nope, Martin said. I'm putting someone else in charge. He scanned the group, letting the suspense build, then pointed at Eric. You. Eric froze, eyes wide. Me? Martin grinned. You've got what it takes, kid. You listen, you ask questions, you follow through. That's leadership. Eric looked like he'd just been handed the nuclear codes. I don't know. You'll have help, Martin said gently. I'll be your backup. But this is your project. Susan's gaze softened as she looked at her son, pride flickering in her eyes like sunlight through leaves. Eric swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay, I'll do it. The kids erupted in cheers. Walter thumped his cane on the porch like a judge approving a verdict. Martin smiled, feeling something warm settle in his chest. This wasn't just about fixing a park. It was about giving a boy a chance to believe in himself. The work begins. The next week was chaos, in the best way. Eric showed up at Martin's house every morning with a notebook full of scribbles and a face full of determination. Martin walked him through the basics: planning, delegating, safety. Eric absorbed it all like a sponge, then marched off to rally his crew. Watching him was like watching a miniature foreman, minus the hard hat and coffee addiction. The kids attacked the park with a vengeance. Weeds were pulled, trash hauled away, rust scraped off metal like old scars. Martin handled the heavy lifting, replacing broken boards, reinforcing the swing set, but he let Eric call the shots. When problems popped up, Eric didn't panic. He asked. He learned. And every time he solved something, Martin saw his confidence grow like a plant finally getting sunlight. Susan came by often, bringing sandwiches and lemonade for the crew. She'd stand off to the side, watching Eric with a smile that made Martin's chest ache in a way he wasn't ready to name. Sometimes they'd talk, about the project, about life, about nothing at all. And every conversation felt easy, like slipping into a warm room after a cold day. The transformation, by Friday, the park was unrecognizable. Fresh paint gleamed on the picnic awnings, the grass was trimmed, and the playground equipment looked almost new. Flowers bloomed in neat beds, planted by the girls who had declared themselves Beautification Command. The swings creaked, but in a good way, like they were stretching after a long nap. Martin stood at the edge of the park, hands in his pockets, and felt something swell in his chest. They'd done it. Eric had done it. The boy stood beside him, sweaty and grinning, his notebook tucked under his arm like a badge of honor. Looks good, huh? Martin looked down at him, smiling. Looks amazing. You killed it, kid. Eric's grin widened. Thanks. Couldn't have done it without you. Martin crouched so they were eye level. You did more than you think. You didn't just fix a park. You led. That's big. Eric's cheeks flushed, and for a second, Martin saw the man he might become. Strong, steady, sure of himself. It hit him harder than he expected. Susan's moment. Susan arrived as the sun dipped low, turning the sky into a watercolor of pink and gold. She stopped at the edge of the park, eyes sweeping over the transformation, and Martin saw her breath catch. Then she looked at Eric, her son, standing tall and proud, and something in her face broke open. She walked over slowly, like she was afraid the moment might vanish if she moved too fast. Eric turned, grinning, and Susan pulled him into a hug so fierce Martin felt it from 3 feet away. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, voice thick. Eric mumbled something into her shoulder, embarrassed but glowing. Martin looked away, giving them privacy, but his chest felt tight. Not in a bad way. In a way that scared him a little, because it felt like belonging. When Susan finally let go, she turned to Martin. Her eyes were bright, and for a second, he thought she might cry. Instead, she smiled. A smile that could have powered the whole town if someone bottled it. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in him. Martin shook his head. He did the work. I just handed him the hammer. Susan laughed, and the sound curled around him like music. Still, you gave him something no one else has. Martin wanted to ask what that was, but he didn't need to. He saw it in Eric's face. Confidence. Hope. A sense that he mattered. And maybe, Martin thought, that was worth more than any porch or park. The festival looms. As they packed up tools and folded chairs, Walter shuffled over, cane tapping like a drumbeat. You know what's next, Davis? Martin grinned. Let me guess. Another party. Walter smirked. Bigger than that. Autumn festival's next week. Town tradition. Rides, games, food. And now that the park looks like heaven instead of hell, it's going to be the centerpiece. Martin raised an eyebrow. Sounds festive. Walter jabbed his cane at him. You better be there. And bring your lady friend. Martin blinked. Lady friend. Walter's grin was pure mischief. Don't play dumb. Half the town's betting on you and Susan. Martin laughed, shaking his head. You people need hobbies. Walter winked. We've got one now. Watching you squirm. Martin chuckled, but as he glanced at Susan, standing in the golden light, laughing with Eric, he felt that spark again. Stronger. Brighter. And for the first time, he didn't want to ignore it. Chapter 8. Autumn Festival Magic. Maplewood hadn't seen this much excitement in years. The Autumn Festival was the town's crown jewel, a tradition older than Walter's cane and twice as stubborn. Every October, the park transformed into a carnival of color and sound. Rides creaked to life, booths sprouted like mushrooms, and the air filled with the scent of fried dough and apple cider. For decades, it had been the heartbeat of Maplewood. Then the park fell apart, and the festival shrank into something sad and obligatory. Not this year. Thanks to Eric and his crew, the park gleamed like a promise. Fresh paint, trimmed grass, flowers blooming like applause. When Martin walked through the gates that Saturday afternoon, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. The good kind. The kind that made your chest feel light and your steps quick. The setup, Martin wasn't alone for long. Walter appeared out of nowhere, cane tapping like a drumbeat, grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. "Davis," Walter barked. "You ready for the big day?" Martin smiled. "Depends. What's the big day?" Walter jabbed his cane toward the crowd. The festival, the food, the games." And his grin turned wicked. "The matchmaking." Martin blinked. "The what now?" Walter leaned in conspiratorially. "Kids have a plan. Been whispering about it all week. Something about cotton candy and funnel cake being romantic." Martin groaned. "You're kidding." Walter slapped his back hard enough to make him stumble. "Nope. They're setting you up with Susan." Martin opened his mouth to protest, but Walter was already hobbling away, cackling like a villain in a Saturday morning cartoon. The kids' scheme. Martin didn't have to wait long to see the plan in action. He spotted Eric near the cider stand, flanked by two of the turquoise-trimmed girls, Maddie and Chloe, whispering like spies on a mission. When they saw Martin, they straightened so fast he almost laughed. "Hey, Mr. Davis." Maddie chirped, all innocence. "Want some cider?" Martin eyed them suspiciously. "Sure." Chloe handed him a cup with a grin that was way too smug. "Susan's over by the Ferris wheel," she said casually. "You should, say hi." Martin sipped his cider, hiding a smile. Subtle. Eric flushed. "We're just making sure you have fun." "Uh-huh," Martin said, amused. "Thanks, team." He walked away, pretending not to notice their high fives. Susan at the Ferris wheel. He found her near the Ferris wheel, watching the ride spin against a sky streaked with orange and pink. She wore a soft sweater the color of autumn leaves, and her hair was loose, curling gently around her shoulders. When she turned and saw him, her smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Hey," she said. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," Martin replied, and meant it. They fell into step together, wandering past booths piled with caramel apples and pumpkin pies. The air smelled like cinnamon and nostalgia. Kids darted around them, laughing, faces sticky with sugar. Martin felt something loosen inside him, a knot he hadn't realized was there. Cotton candy and confessions. They stopped at a cotton candy stand, and Susan laughed when Martin handed her a stick of pink fluff. "Romantic," she teased, eyes sparkling. Martin grinned. "What can I say? I'm a traditionalist." She took a bite, and a wisp of sugar clung to her lip. Martin reached out without thinking, brushing it away with his thumb. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through him. Warm, electric, terrifying in the best way. Susan froze for a second, then smiled softly. "Thanks." Martin cleared his throat, suddenly aware of his heartbeat. "So, Eric did an amazing job on the park." Her face lit up. "He did. I've never seen him so confident." "That's because of you." Martin shook his head. "That's because of him. I just gave him a chance." Susan looked at him, really looked at him, and Martin felt the weight of her gaze like sunlight on skin. "You gave all of us a chance," she said quietly. "This neighborhood, it feels alive again. Because of you." Martin wanted to say something that mattered, but the words tangled in his throat. So he smiled instead, hoping it said what he couldn't. The Ferris wheel moment, the kids struck again. As Martin and Susan wandered past the Ferris wheel, Eric appeared like a magician, grinning from ear to ear. "You two should ride," he said, voice too casual to be innocent. Susan laughed. "Eric, come on," Eric insisted. "It's tradition." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" "Totally," Eric said, shoving 2 tickets into Martin's hand before bolting like a guilty criminal. Susan shook her head, amused. "He's relentless." Martin smiled. "Guess we're riding." The Ferris wheel creaked as they climbed into the car, settling side by side. The ride jolted, then began its slow ascent, lifting them above the festival lights. Below, Maplewood shimmered like a jewel. Warm, imperfect, beautiful. Susan leaned back, sighing softly. "It's been a long time since I did this." Martin glanced at her. "You okay with heights?" She smiled. "I'm okay with this." The words hung between them, soft and heavy. Martin felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with something he hadn't let himself feel in months. Hope. Want. The car swayed gently, and Martin's hand brushed hers. She didn't pull away. The view from the top, at the top, the world felt still. The town stretched out below, bathed in golden light. Martin looked at Susan, and she looked back, and for a moment, everything else fell away. The noise, the past, the weight of what had been. "You know," Martin said quietly, "when I moved here, I thought I was starting over." Susan tilted her head. "And now?" Martin smiled, slow and certain. "Now I think I was starting something." Her breath caught, and Martin saw it. The flicker of something in her eyes that matched the spark in his chest. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But he wanted to. God, he wanted to. The ride jolted, and they laughed, the tension breaking like glass. But the spark stayed, glowing steady and bright. The walk home. Later, as the festival wound down and the stars blinked awake, Martin walked Susan and Eric home. Eric chattered about the rides, the games, the funnel cake he'd eaten like a champion. Susan listened, smiling, but every so often, her gaze flicked to Martin, soft, thoughtful, like she was seeing him in a new light. At her door, she turned to him. "Thanks for tonight." Martin smiled. "Anytime." She hesitated, then touched his arm, a brief, warm press that lingered in his skin long after she stepped inside. Martin stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling like a man who'd just been handed a blueprint for something he didn't know he wanted until now. Something worth building. Chapter 9. Promises and Plans. The festival lingered in Martin's mind like the aftertaste of something sweet. The laughter, the lights, the way Susan's smile had felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. It all stayed with him as he walked home under a sky scattered with stars. But what stayed most was Eric's grin, wide and unguarded, like a boy who'd finally found his place in the world. Martin didn't sleep much that night. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, thinking about blueprints, not for buildings, but for lives. His own, Susan's, Eric's, the neighborhood's. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a locked door. It felt like a porch with fresh paint and a park reborn. It felt possible. The talk. The next afternoon, Martin found Eric sitting on the porch steps, kicking at a stray leaf. The boy looked thoughtful, like someone who'd just finished reading a book and wasn't ready to close it yet. "Hey, boss," Martin said, dropping onto the step beside him. Eric grinned. "Boss, you ran that park project like a pro," Martin said. "You earned the title." Eric shrugged, but his cheeks flushed. It was fun. Martin studied him for a moment. "You know, you've got a knack for this. Leading, building, making things better." Eric's grin faded into something quieter, something almost shy. "You really think so?" "I know so," Martin said. "And I want you to know something else." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm not going anywhere." Eric blinked. "What do you mean?" Martin turned so they were eye level. "I mean, I'm here. For this neighborhood. For your mom. For you. If you'll let me." Eric stared at him, and for a second, Martin saw the walls, the ones built from years of disappointment and absence. Then, slowly, they cracked. Eric's eyes shimmered, and before Martin could say another word, the boy launched himself forward, arms wrapping around Martin's neck in a hug that was fierce and desperate, and everything Martin hadn't known he needed. Martin held him tight, feeling the tremor in his small shoulders. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're allowed to cry." Eric sniffled, embarrassed. "Mom says real men don't cry." Martin smiled, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "Your mom's wrong. Real men cry. It's weakness leaving the body." Eric laughed, a shaky, watery laugh. But it was a laugh, and Martin felt something settle in his chest like a cornerstone. This wasn't just a promise. It was a foundation. Susan's reaction. Susan came out a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She froze when she saw them. Eric still clinging to Martin, Martin's arm draped around the boy's shoulders like it belonged there. For a moment, her face was unreadable. Then it softened, and Martin saw something flicker in her eyes, something warm and fragile, like hope. "You two okay?" she asked gently. Eric pulled back, grinning through the remnants of tears. "Yeah, we're good." Susan smiled, and Martin felt it like sunlight on skin. "Good," she said softly. "That's good." The idea. That night, Martin sat in his garage-turned workshop, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He'd been thinking about the neighborhood, about the kids, about the way Eric had lit up when he learned something new. Schools taught algebra and essays, but they didn't teach how to fix a leaky faucet or wire a light switch. They didn't teach skills that could build a life without drowning in college debt. Martin picked up a pencil and started sketching, not a building, but a plan. A trade school. Small at first, local. Classes in carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. Maybe even landscaping. Real-world skills for real-world jobs. He'd partner with local contractors, get them to donate supplies, maybe even teach. He'd include basic bookkeeping, customer service, things employers wanted but schools ignored. The more he sketched, the more the idea grew roots. This wasn't just a project. It was a mission. A way to give people a future that didn't come with a price tag they could never pay. The conversation. The next day, Martin found Susan in her kitchen, rolling out dough for what smelled like heaven. He hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how domestic it felt, how right it felt. "Got a minute?" he asked. Susan looked up, smiling. "Always." Martin stepped inside, holding the sketch like it was something fragile. "I've been thinking. About the neighborhood. About the kids." Susan wiped flour from her hands and took the paper. Her eyes scanned the lines, the notes, the rough outline of something bigger than both of them. "A trade school," she said softly. Martin nodded. "Not just for kids. For anyone. People need skills. Real skills. And they shouldn't have to go broke to get them." Susan looked at him, and Martin saw it. The spark in her eyes, the same one he felt in his chest. "This is incredible." "It's just an idea," Martin said quickly. "I don't know if it'll work." Susan shook her head. "It'll work. Because you'll make it work." Martin smiled, but it faltered when he saw the shadow cross her face. "What?" She hesitated, then said quietly. "Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you're in this for the long run," she said. "Not just the school. Not just the neighborhood. Us." Martin's breath caught. He hadn't expected her to say it. Not yet. Not like that. But he didn't hesitate. "I promise," he said, voice steady. "I'm all in." Susan searched his face for a long moment, then smiled. A smile that felt like a door opening. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The blueprint for tomorrow. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the kitchen table, sketching plans and making lists. Susan's experience in customer service filled gaps Martin hadn't considered: registration, scheduling, outreach. She was sharp, practical, and relentless, and Martin loved it. Loved the way her mind worked. Loved the way her laugh slipped out when he made a joke about turquoise uniforms for the staff. By evening, the paper was covered in notes, and Martin felt something he hadn't felt in years: a sense of purpose. Not the kind tied to deadlines and profit margins. The kind tied to people, to community, to love. When he walked home under a sky streaked with stars, Martin knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was building a future, and Susan and Eric would be at the center of it. Chapter 10. A future built on love. Winter crept into Maplewood like a quiet guest. Soft snow dusting rooftops, breath fogging in the crisp air, lights twinkling on porches that had been dark for years. The neighborhood looked alive now, vibrant in a way Martin could hardly believe. It wasn't just the repairs, or the flowers, or the fresh paint. It was the people, the laughter spilling from doorways, the kids racing down sidewalks, the sense of pride stitched into every corner. And at the center of it all was Martin Davis, a man who had come here to disappear and somehow ended up building a future. The trade school takes shape. The old hardware store on Main Street had been empty for years, its windows clouded with dust, its shelves stripped bare. Martin saw potential where others saw decay. With the help of local contractors and more than a few stubborn neighbors, the space transformed into something new: Maplewood Skills Center. It wasn't fancy. The floors were scuffed, the walls plain. But the workbenches gleamed, the tools were sharp, and the air hummed with possibility. Martin stood in the doorway on opening day, watching people stream in. Teenagers curious about carpentry, adults eager to learn plumbing or electrical work, even retirees looking for something to keep their hands busy. Local businesses had donated supplies. Employers had sent lists of skills they needed. Susan had handled the logistics like a general commanding an army: registration forms, schedules, outreach. She was relentless, practical, and brilliant. Martin couldn't imagine doing this without her. "Ready?" she asked, stepping up beside him. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes bright with excitement. Martin smiled. "More than ready." She grinned. "Then let's do this." The first class was small, just 8 students gathered around a workbench, eyes wide and eager. Martin started with the basics: measuring, cutting, safety. His voice was steady, his hands sure, but inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not the kind tied to profit margins or corporate deadlines. The kind tied to people, to futures, to hope. When the class ended, the students lingered, asking questions, laughing, making plans to come back. Martin watched them go, his chest tight with something that felt suspiciously like joy. Susan appeared at his side, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You were amazing," she said. Martin chuckled. "I didn't trip over anything. That's a win." She laughed, and the sound curled around him like warmth. "Seriously, Martin, this is going to change lives." He looked at her, really looked at her, the strength in her eyes, the curve of her smile, and felt that spark again, brighter than ever. "Starting with mine," he said softly. Susan's breath caught, and for a moment, the world felt still. The first kiss, it happened that night. The center was quiet, the lights dimmed, the snow falling outside like confetti from heaven. Martin was locking up when Susan appeared in the doorway, her coat dusted with white, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Thought you could use some help," she said, stepping inside. Martin smiled. "Always." They worked in silence for a while, stacking chairs, wiping counters. When the last chair was in place, Martin turned and found her standing close, her eyes soft and searching. "Martin," she whispered. He didn't speak, didn't think. He just reached out, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't lightning. It was something better, something steady and sure, like a foundation laid after years of planning. Susan melted into him, her hands gripping his jacket, and Martin felt everything he'd been holding back spill out in that kiss. Hope, longing, love. When they broke apart, breathless, Susan laughed softly. "Took you long enough." Martin grinned. "I was waiting for the right moment." She smiled, eyes shining. "This feels right." Martin kissed her again, just to prove it. Promises kept. The weeks that followed were a blur of work and wonder. The trade school grew, classes filled, and the neighborhood buzzed with energy. Martin and Susan moved through it all like 2 halves of the same whole, partners in every sense of the word. Eric thrived. He spent hours at the center, learning everything he could, helping Martin with projects, cracking jokes that made Susan roll her eyes and Martin laugh until his sides hurt. One night, as they locked up, Eric looked at Martin and said, "You're the best thing that ever happened to us." Martin swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, kid." Eric grinned, and Martin knew the promise he'd made on that porch wasn't just words. It was truth. The future, spring came, and with it, new beginnings. The center expanded, adding classes in bookkeeping and customer service. Local businesses lined up to hire graduates. The neighborhood bloomed, gardens thriving, houses shining, laughter echoing down streets that had been silent for too long. And Martin? Martin stood in the middle of it all, Susan's hand in his, Eric's laughter ringing in his ears, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Home. Not the kind you build with bricks and beams. The kind you build with trust, with love, with people who choose you, not for what you can give, but for who you are. Martin had lost everything once. His career, his reputation, his plans. But in losing it all, he'd found something better. A future built on love.